The boy hadn't spoken a single word in almost 6 months, not to the doctor, who had come all the way from Tucson with a black bag and careful hands and a voice trained in gentleness, and who had sat with the boy for 2 hours and come away with nothing, not to the sheriff, who had tried in the first weeks with the blunt, well-meaning persistence of a man more accustomed to extracting confessions than coaxing them, and who had eventually stopped trying, not to the schoolteacher, who had read to him and shown him pictures and offered every invitation she knew, every gentle door she could think to open, not even to his grandmother, who had taken him in to everything happened, and who loved him with a fierce and helpless love that expressed itself mostly in the making of food he didn't eat and the asking of questions he didn't answer. She would sit across from him in the evenings with her hands folded in her lap and talk to him about the weather, about the chickens, about the small events of the day in Pale River, and he would look at the middle distance with those dark, emptied eyes, and she would talk until she ran out of things to say, and then the silence would settle over them both like dust. His name was Eli. He was 9 years old, and whatever he had seen on that road outside of town 6 months ago had taken something from him that none of the adults around him knew how to give back. The town of Pale River had accepted his silence the way small towns accept the inexplicable, with whispers, with whirring, with the gradual installation of the condition into the furniture of ordinary life, until the silent boy became simply one of the facts of the place, like the dry creek bed and the listing water tower and the general store that never quite stopped what you needed. Nobody expected it to change. And then a cowboy rode in from the south, on a grey horse, in the late afternoon of a Tuesday in October, and tied up outside the saloon, and ordered a whiskey. He barely touched Dot and Eli, who had been sitting on the fence across the street in his usual way, present, watchful, entirely elsewhere, looked at the cowboy, and something in those dark, emptied eyes moved. *** Pale River was the kind of town that knew its own stories too well. It had the worn, overhandled quality of a place that had been telling the same tales for so long that they'd lost the edges of truth and taken on the smoothness of legend. The founding of it, the dry years, the good years, the family feuds resolved and unresolved, all of it circulated continuously through the saloon and the diner and the spaces between pews at the church on Sunday, refined by repetition into something between history and myth. So when something happened that the town didn't know how to tell, something without a clear shape, without a satisfying resolution, without the narrative logic that makes a story feel finished, it produced a particular discomfort, the kind of discomfort that expresses itself as whispering. The town whispered about Eli. It had started the night of the incident itself, the sheriff's horse arriving in town at speed, the lantern-lit search along the eastern road, the finding of the boy sitting in the dirt 50 yards from the wagon that had been his parents'. The details of what had happened to the wagon and the people in it were known, broadly, in the way that terrible things become known in small communities, traveling without being formally told, arriving in the consciousness of the population through osmosis rather than announcement. Eli had seen it, all of it. That was the assumption, supported by the evidence of what he'd become in the aftermath. He attended school still, at his grandmother's insistence and the teacher's willing accommodation. He sat in his seat. He did written work, competently, which indicated that the intelligence was all still there, intact, simply sealed behind whatever door had closed in him that night. He ate meals, slept, performed the external routines of a functioning child. If you didn't know to look for it, you might not immediately notice the absence, but you looked for it. In Pale River, you couldn't help looking for it. He avoided eyes, not in the guilty or ashamed way, just in the fundamental way of a person who has learned that eyes are where connection begins, and connection is something that currently requires more of him than he has. He moved through spaces with a peripheral awareness of other people that kept him always at a slight distance, close enough to be technically present, far enough that the distance was a choice and not an accident. He never smiled. The teacher, Miss Albright, had 31 years of experience with children, and had seen most of what children were capable of, in the direction of both delight and damage. She told Eli's grandmother that in her professional opinion, the boy was not broken, that broken implied something irreparable, and she did not believe he was irreparable. What he was, she said, was locked, and locks, she said, needed the right key, not the right hammer. The town had been supplying hammers for 6 months. Nobody had found the key ***. His name was Nate Prudo, and he arrived in Pale River the way he arrived everywhere, without announcement and without particular intention of staying. He was 41 years old, lean in the way of someone who ate adequately and never more than that, with a face that had been comprehensively weathered by years of outdoor work and had come out the other side of the weathering looking less like a young man aged and more like a thing that had been shaped by its conditions into something specific and final. He wore the same clothes in approximately the same state of repair every day. He owned a grey horse, a bedroll, a rifle, a change of clothes, a small amount of money, and very little else. He took work where it was available and moved on when it was done. He had done this for 12 years, following a pattern that had become so established that it was no longer a decision, but simply the shape of his life. The way water takes the shape of whatever channel it runs in. People who met him said he was quiet. This was the universal first descriptor, quiet, followed usually by capable, and occasionally, from those who had worked alongside him, by something like good man, delivered with the slight surprise of someone who had expected less. He did not encourage friendship. He was not cold about this, didn't rebuff or freeze out overtures, but he met warmth with a kind of courteous non-responsiveness that communicated, without rudeness, that the warmth was not unwelcome, but neither was it going to find much purchase. People got the message and stopped applying pressure, and usually found themselves respecting him for it, which was not the response they'd expected. He had been described by a woman in a town 200 miles north who had tried and been gently declined, as a man who has decided he's done with certain things. This was perhaps the most accurate description anyone had produced. He had decided, or arrived at through the accumulation of events, a settled indifference to the getting and losing of things, connections, places, situations, that might have read as contentment if you didn't look too carefully, and as something considerably sadder if you did. He had no family. He did not talk about why. He tied his horse outside the saloon in Pale River and ordered a whiskey and sat with it, and was not particularly aware of the boy on the fence across the street. The boy, however, was aware of him. Nate became conscious of this gradually, the particular feeling of sustained attention from a fixed point, the awareness of being watched that a careful man develops through long practice. He looked across the street without moving his head much, and found the boy sitting on the fence with both hands gripping the rail, looking at Nate with an expression that was not the usual frank curiosity of childhood. It was something else, something more searching, the expression of a person who has been looking at faces for a long time, measuring them against some internal criterion, and is surprised to find that this one gives a different reading. Nate looked back, briefly, and then looked away. He didn't think much of it. The horse, though, the grey horse, whose name was North, because that had been the direction Nate was riding when he acquired him, and he hadn't thought to name him anything else. North turned his head and looked at the boy on the fence with the relaxed, benevolent attention that good horses give to things they find unthreatening, and the boy's grip on the fence rail loosened, very slightly. It happened 3 days after Nate's arrival, at dusk, with no witnesses. Nate had taken a few days of fence work on the Garber Ranch east of town, which gave him reason to be in Pale River for the week, and the reason to be at the livery in the evenings, tending to North. He had no particular awareness of the boy beyond having noticed him once. He was not paying special attention, but the livery was quiet at that hour, and the door was open, and he was grooming North in the back stall when he heard the sound of feet stopping at the entrance. He didn't look up immediately. North looked, which was information in itself, The horse's ears came forward with interest rather than alertness, which meant whatever had stopped at the door was not something North considered worth worrying about. Nate straightened and looked. The boy was standing at the entrance to the livery with his hands at his sides, looking at North with an expression they hadn't seen on the face he'd observed across the street. Something unguarded, something that the sealed, careful blankness had cracked slightly to let through, something that was almost hunger, the way you look at something you've wanted for a long time and have been afraid to approach. Nate looked at the boy. The boy didn't look at him, kept his eyes on North. Nate thought for a moment. Then he turned back to what he was doing. He groomed the horse with the same slow, methodical strokes, working down the neck and across the shoulder, the way he always did it, and said nothing, and did not look at the boy again. He kept his movements unhurried, unperformative, just the ordinary work of a man caring for his horse in the evening, with no additional significance attached to anything. After perhaps 2 minutes, he heard the feet move. The boy came into the livery, not quickly, the speed of someone testing each step before committing to it, ready to reverse at any moment. He stopped about 4 feet from North's head, in the available light from the open door, and stood there. North turned his head and looked at the boy with those large, equable eyes. The boy looked back. Nate kept grooming. Another minute passed. Then the boy took 1 step forward and raised a hand, slow, careful, from below, the way you approach an animal you want to trust you. And North stretched his nose forward and touched the offered hand with his upper lip. The boy went absolutely still, not the frozen stillness of fear, the stillness of someone receiving something they had not expected and are afraid to move in case it stops. Nate said nothing. He moved around to North's other side, continuing his work, putting the horse's body between himself and the boy, removing himself from the equation as much as he could without leaving entirely. He heard, from the other side of the horse, the very quiet sound of a child exhaling, the long, slow exhale of a breath held for a long time. Not 6 minutes, longer than that, much longer. He kept working. They stayed like that until the light was gone. The boy with his hand on the horse's nose, Nate on the other side, going through the motions of work he'd already finished. Neither of them speaking, neither of them leaving. When it was fully dark, Nate heard the feet move again, back toward the door, out of the livery, gone into the evening. He came around North's shoulder and stood in the empty doorway and looked at the street. The boy was already halfway down the block, walking toward the lighted window of the house where his grandmother lived. He didn't look back. Nate stood there for a moment. Then he went back inside and put away the brush. ***. The boy came back the next evening. And the one after that. By the end of the week, it had become a pattern. Eli appearing at the livery door at the same hour. North turning to look at him with recognition. Nate making whatever adjustments to his presence were necessary to give the boy room, while not withdrawing entirely. They developed a wordless routine. Eli would spend time with North, grooming him, learning the locations of things by watching Nate and replicating the gestures, filling the water bucket with an earnestness of purpose that Nate found both useful and quietly affecting. Nate would work around him, narrating occasionally in a low, matter-of-fact tone, not addressing Eli directly, not requiring response, just providing a verbal landscape that the boy could inhabit without pressure. Left foreleg first, then right. He doesn't like the wide brush on his face. Use the small one. He'll tell you when he's had enough. You'll feel it in how he shifts. Eli listened. Nate could tell he listened from the way his hands changed, applying the information, adjusting, doing it right. Pale River noticed. Small towns notice everything, but they notice children with particular vigilance, and Eli was already a subject of significant attention. Within a few days of the evening visit's beginning, the situation had been observed, discussed, theorized about, and worried over by a substantial portion of the population. The worrying took different forms. Eli's grandmother, whose name was Margaret, came to the livery on the 5th day and spoke with Nate for the first time. She was a compact, precise woman in her mid-60s, with silver hair and eyes that had the quality of having seen enough of life to be done with indirect approaches. She told him about Eli, not everything, not the details of the incident on the road, which she delivered in a single careful sentence that communicated the essential facts without the images, but the before and the after. The boy he had been, talkative, curious, fearless in the particular way of children who have grown up feeling safe. The boy he had become. She looked at Nate while she said all of this with the frank, assessing look of a woman deciding how much trust a situation warranted. "He's at ease with you," she said. "I don't understand it, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt a little, that he won't." She stopped. "Control something. But it's the first time in 6 months he's looked forward to anything. I can see it in the mornings. Now, he wakes up and there's something there that wasn't there before." Nate said he hadn't done anything. Margaret said she knew. "That might be exactly why," she said. The suspicion came from elsewhere. Tom Viscuri, who owned the hardware store and considered himself a practical man with practical instincts, raised concerns in the saloon one evening about an unknown drifter spending time with a traumatized child. He was not wrong to raise them. They were the concerns a responsible community member should raise, but the manner in which he raised them had the quality of a man enjoying the raising more than was entirely appropriate. Dutch Sheriff Beaumont, who was a more careful man than his predecessor in the role had been, looked into it in the way of a sheriff doing his job without prejudice, asked questions in other towns, sent a wire or two, paid attention. What he found was a man without record, without complaints, without anything that gave cause for concern. Beyond the ordinary mystery of a private person, he came to the livery one afternoon and spoke to Nate directly. Nate answered his questions without defensiveness or resentment. Yes, he was aware of the boy's situation. No, he hadn't sought out the contact. The boy had come to him. Yes, he understood the town's concern. No, he had no intention of doing anything other than what he had been doing, which was tending his horse. Beaumont looked at him for a long moment. "The grandmother's all right with it," Beaumont said. "She told me," Nate said. "That's enough for me," Beaumont said. He paused. "The boy," he stopped, tried again. "We've all been trying to get through to him for months. Whatever you're doing, I hope you keep doing it." "I'm not doing anything," Nate said. "I know," Beaumont said, in the same tone Margaret had used. That might be exactly it. It came to Nate in fragments, the way truth usually comes, not in a single revelation but in small pieces that accumulate until the shape of the whole becomes visible. He learned the broad facts from Margaret and from the inevitable dispersal of information in a small town, the wagon on the eastern road, the ambush, not a robbery, something more specific and more terrible, a dispute that had followed Eli's father from a previous town, a cadet unpaid, arriving without warning on a road in the dark. Eli had been in the back of the wagon, covered by a canvas, waiting out the cold. He'd stayed there throughout. He'd heard everything. He'd seen enough, coming out from under the canvas at the wrong moment, to understand what had happened. And then he'd sat in the road beside it until the sheriff's lamp found him. Hours later, in the dark, 6 months of silence. Nate sat with this information over several days. In the private way he sat with things, turning it over without letting it show. He knew about trauma, not from education or professional knowledge, but from the intimate familiarity of personal acquaintance. He knew what it did to a person's relationship with language, with trust, with the ordinary assumption that the world was safe to engage with. He knew how a single event could reorganize everything, all the architecture of a self, rebuilt around a terrible center. Every subsequent day spent navigating the new layout. He knew because he had done it himself. What had happened to Nate was different in its specifics and the same in its essentials, a loss, sudden and complete, that had arrived without warning and left behind a person he didn't entirely recognize as himself. The withdrawal from people, from places, from everything that required him to be present in a way that exposed him. That had been his version of the silence. A different shape, the same interior. He had never told anyone this. He had never, in 12 years of moving from place to place, met someone whose situation had made him want to. He was not certain he wanted to now. He was not a man who opened things he'd closed, as a matter of careful principle, but he found himself, in the evenings in the livery, aware of the boy in a way that went beyond the practical, aware of what the silence cost, aware, because he knew the cost himself, of what was being spent every day to maintain it. He thought about this for several days. And then one evening, while Eli was brushing North's flank with the small brush and Nate was doing nothing in particular nearby, he said, not looking at the boy, looking at the middle distance, something he had not said out loud before, he said, when I was about your age, I saw something I didn't know how to carry. Eli's brushstroke slowed. I didn't stop talking, Nate said. I talked too much, for a while, said a lot of things that didn't mean anything, because the thing I actually needed to say felt too big to fit into words. He paused. And then I stopped trying. The brush stopped entirely. It doesn't get smaller, Nate said. The thing you're carrying, I want to be honest with you about that, but you get stronger if you let yourself, if you let other people close enough to help with it. He was quiet for a moment. I'm still working on that part, he said. The letting people close. He didn't look at Eli. He wasn't performing this, wasn't calculating the effect, wasn't trying to produce a result. He was simply saying a true thing in the presence of someone he thought needed to hear it. Without expectation, without agenda. North stood patient and solid between them. After a long time, Eli resumed brushing, slow, careful strokes, but Nate noticed, when the boy left that evening, that the set of his shoulders was slightly different than it had been when he arrived. Some architecture had shifted, not much, but something. The riding lessons began without being proposed. One morning, Nate was preparing North for the day's work. Eli having appeared earlier than usual, before school, Nate simply took the boy by both hands and lifted him up onto North's back without ceremony. The way you do something when you've decided to do it, and discussion would only complicate matters. Eli went rigid. North stood perfectly still, which he was good at, which was one of the reasons Nate had kept him for 7 years. Nate put one hand on the boy's knee. He won't move unless I ask him to, he said. You've been around him enough to know that. He doesn't do anything without reason. A long moment. The rigidity in Eli's body eased by degrees, not all at once, not completely, but perceptibly, the way ice at the edge of a river yields as the temperature rises. Incrementally, the change only visible. When you compare it to what it was, Nate took the lead rope and walked North in a slow circle around the livery yard. Eli sat on the horse's back with his hands on the pommel and looked at the ground moving below him with an expression that went through several phases: fear, concentration, cautious attention, and then something that wasn't any of those things, something that preceded them all in the development of a child: simple, physical delight, the particular pleasure of movement, of height, of a body that is doing something new and finding out it can. He didn't smile, not yet, but something in his face opened toward it. After that, it was a regular thing. Mornings when it was possible, occasional evenings, the slow transfer of skill and confidence that happens between a good horse and a willing student. Nate taught him without teaching, narrating, demonstrating, allowing the boy's hands and body to learn the thing while his mind observed. The way physical knowledge accumulates more surely when not overthought. Eli absorbed it with the focused attention he applied to everything, and he was good at it, which Nate told him without elaboration, because being told plainly that you're good at something matters, and false modesty serves nobody. They also worked together on the ordinary maintenance of the livery, the mucking and the feeding and the small repairs that an old wooden building perpetually requires, side by side, in companionable silence, or in the low back and forth of a man describing what he was doing and the boy listening. Nate had learned, over the weeks, to speak in a way that invited response without requiring it, sentences that left a space at the end, a natural place where a reply could go, unhurried, undemanded. Eli never filled the spaces, but He listened in a way that was more present than silence usually is. Margaret came to the livery one Saturday and watched them for a while from the doorway before they knew she was there. She told Nate later, over coffee she'd brought as pretext, that it was the first time she'd seen the boy work at something with pleasure since before the incident. She said it the way people say things that cost them to say, carefully, with control, with the particular dignity of grief that has learned to contain itself. Nate said the boy had real ability with horses. Margaret looked at him. You know that's not what I'm talking about, she said. I know, Nate said. I didn't want to make it bigger than it is yet. Fair enough, she said, and left the coffee. The day it happened was an unremarkable Thursday. They were in the stall together, working in the afternoon light, Eli cleaning North's hooves with the pick in the careful, practiced way he'd learned, Nate sitting on the fence rail watching and not watching, doing the particular thing he'd gotten good at, which was being present without being pressuring. North shifted his weight, a comfortable shift, nothing significant, just a horse being a horse. Eli put his hand on the horse's flank to steady him, the way he'd been taught, and said, easy, one word in a voice that was slightly rough from months of disuse, a voice that was still recognizably a child's voice, that had the texture of something that had been put away and was coming back out into the air for the first time. Neither of them moved. Nate did not react. He held himself still with the discipline of a man who understood, with complete certainty, that the wrong response right now would cost everything. No exclamation, no sudden movement, no drawing of attention to what had just happened that might make the boy aware of it in a way that would seal the door again. North stood still, settled by the hand on his flank. Eli looked at the hoof he was working on, and then, after a moment, he looked up at Nate. His eyes were wet. He didn't wipe them, didn't look away, didn't retreat. He just looked at Nate with those dark eyes that had been empty for 6 months, and were not empty now. Nate looked back. After a moment, he said, good, just that. The same word he used for the riding, for the grooming, for all of it. Good, unhurried and plain. The word that meant you did the thing, and you did it right. And that's all this needs to be right now. Eli held his gaze for another moment. Then he looked back at the hoof, and picked up the pick, and went back to work, and in the stall, in the ordinary light of an ordinary Thursday afternoon, with a grey horse standing patient between them, something that had been locked for 6 months turned, not all the way, not all at once, but enough. After that Thursday, the words came slowly, not a flood, nothing so dramatic or so simple, more like the first small movements of a frozen river in early spring, when the ice hasn't broken, but you can hear, if you're listening, the water beginning to move underneath. Single words, then short phrases, then occasional sentences, spoken quietly and only when the moment and the person warranted them. He spoke to Nate first and most, then, by degrees, to Margaret, who received the first full sentence from her grandson with a composure that lasted until she was alone in her kitchen, where it failed completely, and she sat at the table and cried with a thoroughness and a gratitude that left her wrung out and lighter than she'd felt in 6 months. He spoke to Miss Albright at school. She did not make a fuss of it, because she was a good teacher who understood that making a fuss of a child's return to the world is a way of making the world about your own relief, rather than his recovery. She simply incorporated his voice back into the class with the matter-of-fact grace of a woman who had always known it belonged there. He did not speak to everyone. There were people in Pale River he still moved around carefully, still maintained his distance from. And this was his right, and Nate had never suggested otherwise. Healing is not the same as forgetting. The cautious knowledge that the world is capable of terrible things does not go away, because the world also turns out to be capable of Thursday afternoons in livery stables. Both are true. Learning to live with both truths, rather than letting one negate the other. That is the work. And it is long work, and it had barely started. But it had started. Nate stayed in Pale River through November and into December, longer than he'd stayed anywhere in years. for reasons he examined only briefly and then left alone. The way you leave alone a thing that is working and would be disrupted by too much examination. The job at the Garber Ranch extended, and then other work appeared, and Pale River being what it was, the appearance of work had less to do with the availability of work and more to do with a community that had found reasons to need him there. He became known. This was unfamiliar, and he managed it with the limited social vocabulary of a man who had avoided it for a long time and was learning, slowly, how to be known without losing the parts of himself that required solitude. It was an imperfect process. He was better at it some days than others. Tom Viscurry bought him a drink at the saloon one evening and apologized, in the clipped, minimal way of a man who finds apology physically uncomfortable, for the things he'd said in the early weeks. Nate said he didn't hold it and meant it, because Viscurry hadn't been wrong to ask the questions, only graceless in the asking. They shook hands. It wasn't a friendship, but it was something adjacent to respect, which between certain kinds of men is the more durable courtesy. Margaret fed him dinner twice a week, with the firm insistence of a woman who has decided something and will not be argued with. He ate it with the quiet gratitude of a man who has been feeding himself alone for long enough to have lost perspective on what a meal at a table with other people is worth. Eli sat next to him at these dinners and talked, not constantly, not with the recovered fluency of a child who had never been silenced, but in the particular careful way of someone who has realized that words are worth spending. He talked about North, mostly, about the riding, about the small detailed world of the livery and the horses and the things Nate had taught him. He talked about his parents less, and when he did it was with the measured, tender sorrow of a child who is learning how to carry something, not over it, not past it, but with it, which is the only honest way. Nate left in January. He had stayed long enough that the leaving had to be acknowledged. There was no riding out quietly in the grey morning without people knowing, without a small collection of them being at the livery when he saddled North. Margaret was there, and Miss Albright, and Beaumont, and a few others who had moved from watching him with suspicion to something else through the course of the preceding months. Eli was there. He stood beside North the way he always stood, hand on the horse's neck, not gripping, just present, and watched Nate check the cinch and the saddlebag and do the ordinary preparations of departure with the same unhurried thoroughness he applied to everything. When Nate was done, he turned and looked at the boy. Eli looked back at him. "You're going to be all right," Nate said. "I know," Eli said. He said it quietly and without bravado, in the tone of a simple statement of known fact. Nate nodded. He mounted North, touched his hat to Margaret, and rode out. He didn't look back, not because he didn't want to, but because he had learned somewhere in the preceding months that a clean departure is a kind of gift you give to the people staying, the gift of a completed thing rather than a prolonged one. But he was carrying something when he left that he hadn't been carrying when he'd arrived. Not in any way he could easily name. Just a difference in the interior weather. Some long cold place where the temperature had, without his entirely noticing, begun to change. He rode south in the January light and thought about the boy speaking that one word to the horse on a Thursday afternoon in the livery, and thought about what it had cost to speak it, and thought about all the things he himself had been keeping silent for 12 years, and considered, not for the first time, but with more honesty than he'd previously been able to manage, whether silence was protection or simply another name for distance, and whether distance was the same as safety, and whether safety was really what he was after or just what he'd told himself when the real thing seemed too difficult to attempt. He didn't resolve the question, but he rode with it, which was more than he'd been willing to do before, and North moved under him easy and willing in the cold clear morning, and the road ahead was long, and for the first time in a long time, that felt less like a fact and more like a possibility. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with words. Sometimes it begins with someone who simply stays, who makes no demands, and sets no conditions and asks for nothing except to be allowed to be present. And in being present, in the patient, unhurried, uncomplicated gift of just being there, gives a frightened, broken person something they had stopped believing existed, proof that the world still contains people worth trusting. That is where it begins, every time. Asterisk. If this emotional cowboy story touched your heart, subscribe to Broken Spur Stories for more Western redemption stories filled with emotion, healing, and unforgettable cowboys. And tell me in the comments, do you believe silence can sometimes hide the deepest pain?